welcome to another reading of Bhutanese history from Dr. Karma Phunstok. Here is an image of Rumtek Monastery, which I saw from a vlog as well. Long live all the Dharma protectors. And I will adjust this. Om Ahom Rajaguru Pema. One of the vlogs I saw of Rumtek Monastery discusses how they offer Guru Rinpoche pujas every day, or very often. So that was very auspicious. Jestile! Here we have the Guru tree. Okay. The Bhutanese fought gallantly and left remarkable impression of their military courage and skills on the British. The bravery of their commander, probably Nawang Tenzin from Paro, was specifically noted by a Kuch Bihari source. Nawang Tenzin, who was a devotee of Shakya Tenzin, had already distributed most of his wealth and possessions for various religious works. He even set aside funds for his funerary rites before he set off to the war. He was ready to die, and die he did in the fearless way of a hero. According to this source, he led an army from the northern position of Bhutan, who were half as tall again as ordinary men, and were of very fair complexion and spoke a dialect unintelligible to the southern Bhutanese. Unwilling to submit even at the final point of defeat and cornered at the fort by hundreds of sepoys armed with guns, he and a few of his men pounced on the sepoys with the last dash of valor. Our source narrates, the sepoys used the bayonet, succeeded now and again in slaying the enemy. But the Bhutias fired their muskets with their left hands and attacked the sepoys with the small swords which they held in their right. Jimpei Zimpong received 20 wounds in various parts of his body, and even after he had fallen to the ground, he kept waving his sword in the air. An English officer went up and helped by procuring surgical aid, but all that Jimpei asked for was some spirits to drink. The officer at once gave him some brandy, and Jimpei drank it and expired. R.I.P. The English, our source says, measured the height and size of this gigantic man, for there had never been seen such powerful man before. He may have been one of the strong men who were popular in traditional Bhutan. Nawang Tenzin, whether or not he can be identified with this warrior, certainly died during the war, and his funerary rites were carried out by his guru Shakya Tenzin, who, like many other lamas at the time, were occupied by the funerary prayers and rituals for the men lost in war. The loss of many lives in the war against the British was not the only tragedy to befall Bhutan by the end of 1773. This war was barely over when internal conflict erupted in Bhutan. The deprivations of war in the south must have exacerbated the seething tension between the Shidar faction and his opponents. The reigning hierarch Jigme Senge officially removed Shidar from the Desi's office and appointed Kunga Rinchen as the 17th Desi. Following this, those who opposed Shidar openly attacked the supporters of Shidar, and some of his family members barely escaped death. by taking refuge in the residence of Jekempo Yontan Taye. When the war in the south was finally over, the government blamed Shidar for the losses and banned him from returning to the capital. All checkpoints were ordered to arrest or shoot him if he tried to return. Shidar, however, managed to sneak into Paro and take refuge with the monastic elder of the Paro Zong, but before long, his opponents found out and came for him. The biographer of the contemporary hierarch, Shakya Tenzin, who lived in Paro, reports that members of Shidar's faction were yoked to misery. Paro Zong, surrounded by the armed forces and the noise of firearms and battle, reverberated day and night. Shidar escaped from Paro and, according to most Bhutanese sources, was killed in 1773. However, this we know from the 6th Panchen Lama's biography was not the case. Shidar made it to Tibet to seek refuge in the court of the 6th Panchen Lama, Palden Yeshe, 1738 to 80, who was at that time the most powerful figure in Tibet, the 8th Dalai Lama being in his minority. Shidar had a good relationship with the 6th Panchen Lama, as we have seen above. Earlier in 1772, as Desi, he even sent a mission to the Panchen Lama to offer him New Year greetings. Now Shidar arrived as a refugee, and Panchen Lama took care of him, providing him requisites and advices. Shidar must have arrived in Jashimunpo sometime at the beginning of 1774, by which time the Panchen Lama was fully aware of the Anglo-Bhutanese conflict. The envoys from the new Gorkha king of Nepal, who visited him in the middle of 1773, already briefed him about the war and requested him to mediate. Then there were the Tibetan monk Pema and the Indian priest Gosain Puran Giri, who traveled between India and Tibet, carrying news and messages for the Panchen Lama. However, it was probably only after Shidar's arrival and at his request that the Panchen Lama decided to write an official letter to mediate Warren Hastings. He wrote it to Warren Hastings in very poetic and hyperbolic language, typical of the Tibetan art of letter writing. In the letter, he wrote, after the customary praises, "I have been repeatedly informed that you have been engaged in hostilities against Desi Shidar, to which it is said, the Desi's own criminal conduct in conducting ravages and other outrages on your frontiers has given rise. As he is of a rude and ignorant race, it is not unlikely that he has now renewed these instances, and the ravages and plunder which he may have committed on the skirts of the Bengal and Kuch Bihar provinces have given you provocation to send your vindictive army against him. However, his party has been defeated. Many of his people have been killed. 3 forts have been taken from him, and he has met with the punishment he deserved. And it is evident that your army has been victorious, and that if you had been desirous of it, you might, in the space of 2 days, have entirely extirpated him, for he had not power to resist your efforts. But now I take upon me to be his mediator and to represent to you that as the Desi is dependent upon His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who rules in this country with unlimited sway. But on account of him being in the minority, the charge of the government and administration for the present is committed to me. Should you persist in offering further molestation to the Desi's country, it will irritate both the Lama and all his subjects against you. Therefore, from a regard to our religion and customs, I request you will cease all hostilities against him, and in doing this you will confer the greatest favor and friendship upon me." The letter ends with the customary remarks of humility. Delivered by Gosain Puran Giri, this letter was the first case of Tibetan official correspondence with the British, and thus with the Western world. The Western This is a photography piece presented to Macau, I think recently, the Western world. Macau was a Portuguese colony, that's why. It started a series of fascinating but brief exchanges between two progressive and eminent figures in the region at that time, Warren Hastings and the sixth Panchen Lama, perhaps carried away by such fascination. Many of today's writers on this exchange easily overlook the fact that the letter was not written by the Panchen Lama to mediate at the request of the Bhutanese state. The Bhutanese, except perhaps Shidar, was unaware of the Panchen Lama's mediation. It is, one can clearly see, a Tibetan story claiming that Bhutan is a dependency of the Dalai Lama, which the Bhutanese at that time would have denied, and the British soon discovered was not the case. Even as a remote tributary as the Dalai Lama was to the Chinese emperor. Also, we have only access to the English translation, which may not have exactly captured the mood and connotations of the original letter, which the Panchen Lama wrote in Persian. The sixth Panchen Lama knew this language through his mother, who was from a place in the western Himalayas where Persian was spoken. Anyway, we know for sure that the letter was received in Calcutta on 29th March 1774. By then, fighting had fully stopped, and the EIC, East India Company, and the new government of Kunga Rinchen had already negotiated a 10-point treaty, which was signed by the Bhutanese sometime in March 1774 and by Warren Hastings on 25th April 1774. The main official representing Bhutan in the negotiation of the treaty was perhaps Sengye Gyatso, who spent the hot spring of 1774 in India. He later became the Ponlop of Dagana, most likely as a reward for his service. As Perling found the occupied territory inhospitable, he recommended Hastings to restore all areas occupied by them after the war in exchange for 5 Tangun horses. The British, like the Indian and Tibetans, as we saw in the chapter before, admired these Bhutanese horses. Thus, the former border of control was restored, and the Bhutanese agreed to return King Dajendra and the Diwan Dio, the financial minister, which they did with gifts. They were from Kuch Bihar. This king, however, did not experience any joy of release when he reached his kingdom. Instead, he was flabbergasted by the agreement his Nazir had reached with the British in order to get military support. Dejected by the idea of being made a king under a foreign overlord, he made his son Darendra occupy the throne until the latter's death in 1775. The treaty also granted the Bhutanese merchants right to trade in the company's territory without duties, and the company to cut timber from Bhutan's forests without duties. The two parties also agreed to a mutual release of prisoners and expulsion and extradition of criminals and offenders, especially sannyasins who had been a menace to the East India Territory. Sounds like the trade stuff going on these days. Bogle and the first British mission to Bhutan. Hastings' overtures for friendly relations with Bhutan and Tibet, which he did not yet know were two different countries, had far-sighted economic considerations. Beside the fiscal benefit the EIC could reap from trade with the immediate Tibet-Bhutan to the north, he envisioned the link might provide a new trade route to China or contact with the Chinese emperor via the Himalayas. This would have been highly significant as the company's trade with China was highly lucrative and substantial, and the business through the existent route of Guangzhou, Canton, was proving to be difficult. The East India Company was still intrinsically a commercial entity, although it was running parts of India like a government, and its profit-bearing interests were of paramount importance to the concerns of its court of directors. Tibet-Bhutan provided a new and prospective avenue for such commercial gains. Moreover, Hastings, living in the final years of the European Enlightenment, had an enormous interest in the exploration of knowledge and cultures of faraway places. Warren Hastings, what a man. Given these reasons, when Hastings received the friendly letter from the Panchen Lama and had the treaty signed with the Bhutanese, he was only too willing to pursue further communications. Merely 2 months after the treaty was signed, Hastings dispatched the first and perhaps most interesting British mission to Bhutan, Tibet, led by a young Scotsman named George. Besides trading opportunities, George was to find out the geography, agriculture, livestock, culture, governance, and, in fact, everything. He was told to keep a diary, inserting whatever passes before your observation, which shall be characteristic of the people, the country, the climate, or the road, their manners, customs, buildings, cookery, etc., or interesting to the trade of this country. Carry with you a pencil and a pocketbook for the purpose of minuting short notes of every fact or remark as it occurs, putting them in order at your leisure while they are fresh in your memory. With these instructions, 35 servants and 22 porters, George and his attendant Surgeon Alexander Hamilton set off in the heat of May 1774 from Calcutta. He entered Bhutan's territory on 9th June and arrived in Thimphu on 28th June 1774. Bogle compiled with Hastings' wishes by keeping a detailed journal and writing reports and letters about his trip. His journal, which Hastings considered was equal to the standard of Captain Cook's travels, is one of the earliest and most informative records of Bhutan by a European visitor. The British mission was received by the new Desi Kunga Rinchen and his court on 5th July 1774 at Jashi Chozong, which Bogle described as a palace in a formal ceremony involving several rounds of tea. Curiously, George was even dressed in a silk go and blessed by the Desi with a statue of the Buddha. After this formal reception, the Desi and George met several times without formalities, the main topic of their discussion being the permission for George's journey to Tibet. The Panchen Lama sent letters and presents to George asking him to return to Bengal. He reasoned that by letting George into Tibet, he risked annoying the Chinese emperor, whom he considered as his ultimate overlord. George persisted with his wish, supported by his Bhutanese hosts, and finally got the consent to enter Tibet in the beginning of October 1774. He was ready to take leave when fighting broke out between the government and people supporting Shidar in Thimphu. The insurgents attacked the capital, but soon retreated to find a base in Semtoka, which the state troops put under siege. After their access to basic resources, including water, was cut off, the insurgents gave up their position and fled in moonlight on 12 October 1774 and escaped to Tibet. George then left Thimphu the following day via Paro to make a grueling and cold journey to Jashi Lumpur. He saw the aftermaths of some of the skirmishes and extirpation of rebels and their supporters on his way. The tale of George's successful mission to Tibet and striking friendship with the 6th Panchen Lama shall not be told here. There are already a number of published materials on this. George returned to Bhutan on his way to Calcutta the following year, arriving in Thimphu on 8th May 1775. The two most significant achievements of Kunga Rinchen's short rule as the Desi were the successful suppression of the rebellion of Shidar's faction and the opening of good relations with the British. The insurrection by Shidar's faction could have easily spiraled into a full-scale civil war as in the past if it was not suppressed quickly or if the Tibetans or Chinese gave Shidar active support. Shidar is said to have sought military support from the Tibetan regent and even from China by offering them in return to keep 2 Chinese officials in Bhutan like the Ambans in Lhasa and to pay regular annual tributes. Were Shidar's design to succeed, Bhutan could have faced another invasion from the north and have risked no more being what George called this state, naturally free and independent. Fortunately for Bhutan, the Panchen Lama took a conciliatory approach as a mediator between Bhutan and the ousted Desi, maintaining a good relationship with Bhutan and a close and caring watch over Shidar and his faction. Shidar was in the Panchen Lama's monastery until just a day or two before George's arrival on 9th November 1774, when he moved to Gyantse, from where he must have continued his unsuccessful campaign. On 26 May 1775, an envoy from the Panchen Lama and the Tibetan regent arrived in Timbu requesting the Desi's government to allow some 80 insurgents to return to their homes in Bhutan and also to grant Shidar a regional governorship or some other post in the government. But the requests seem to have fallen on deaf ears, and Shidar's insurgency would continue for some years, although Shidar almost certainly died by the end of 1775, probably executed after being caught by Bhutanese troops. R.I.P. Alexander Hamilton gives two accounts, one of which states that Shidar's head was brought back fixed on a pole to Punakha. The opening of relations with the British was indeed a very tricky issue, mainly due to fear of the unknown. The Bhutanese leaders did not clearly know who the British, or Piling as they called them, Piling, were or where they came from and what they wanted. George wrote that some of them look upon the company as a great Raja, others say it is a woman, and most did not know what to make of it. Strangely, for an envoy assigned to start friendly relations, George thought it was no business of his to teach them, and their poor understanding of the British only hindered George's endeavor for a trade agreement. The conservative clergy saw the British as a barbaric group who had not seen the light of the Buddha's wisdom. The regents Jigme Senge, whom George described as someone with more curiosity than any man I have seen in the country, met George many times, but he was harshly rebuked by the former Je Kempo Yontan Taye for interacting with the British and being enamored of their goods. From a strict tantric religious perspective, it was wrong to associate and develop ties with someone who has been formally identified as a target of tantric ritual killing, an enduring view of the English which the Orthodox clergy held until very recent times was as barbaric people and heretical outsiders bereft of higher Buddhist morality and understanding. In the eyes of a politician with some information, the British were foreigners who had come under the masquerade of trade and commerce and now controlled Bengal, their immediate neighbor to the south, and were forcing their way deeper into the Himalaya hills. They were unaware of the East India Company's beginning as a commercial venture. Thus, they had every reason to be suspicious. Some officials, such as the state chief of protocol, were politically astute and knew only too well that trade was followed by a takeover. It is thus astonishing that a mission and an exchange were allowed at all. Much of the credit for the successful mission and the good relations must go to the forward-thinking and congenial character of the people involved. Perhaps influenced by the ethos of the Age of Enlightenment, Warren Hastings and George Bogle were adventurous, open-minded, and accommodating persons, characteristics which were shared by the sixth Panchen Lama, and to some extent also by the Bhutan Desi. George, in particular, was a good-humored and gentle person who believed in adapting himself to the custom of the country as far as possible. Desi Kunga Rinchen was highly cultured and composed, and not a strong and forceful character as was his precursor. However, for his mildness, he was also indecisive and dependent on other officials. The ministers and leading officials around him were also approachable and friendly people, although some of them were politically astute. Jigme Senge, the reigning Gyaltsab, was also very inquisitive and sociable, as we shall see in a later chapter. The mission was trying to establish a route to Tibet via Bhutan, as it was no longer easily manageable through Kathmandu, which was now under the Gorkhas. The Bhutanese strongly resisted this, giving a host of reasons, but George insisted that it was fundamental to the new relations between Bhutan and the East India Company, a relationship which has been initiated by the signing of the post-war treaty. The Bhutanese stood their ground, and George had to diplomatically request the free access of local traders and the exclusion of any European. The Bhutanese still resisted, arguing that it could lead to further misunderstanding between Bhutan and the company if these South Asian merchants became victims of banditry or theft. They argued that the Bhutanese country is rugged, the routes unsafe, there was no proper trade mart, and too many traders could burden the local population. George persisted in getting past these objections, but was more often than expected outmaneuvered by the negotiating skills of the officials. They were the cleverest at Jashi Chozong. George was repeatedly surprised by the demands of this officer in return for allowing access of trade through Bhutan. The officer's demands included free trading rights and protection for Bhutanese merchants in Rangpur and Bengal, which the company happily provided, monopoly over various trade items, the reduction of the prices of fish and oil, which had gone up since the war, return of some villages in the Baikuntapur area, which were formerly tributaries of Bhutan, and even the complete return of the Kuch Bihar territory, as the king was finding it difficult to pay the hefty tribute to the British and had even appealed to Bhutan for loans. George Bogle suggested submitting a petition to the governor on the last two, as he had no mandate to deliberate on territorial issues. Bogle was in fact exacerbated by the points raised and demands made by this official. He conceded, "You are far too able a negotiator for me." After negotiating and lobbying with the official of Timbu, official of Paro, George finally received an affirmative response from the Desi on 28 May 1775, allowing Hindu and Muslim merchants to travel via Bhutan between Bengal and Tibet. The question of whether Tibetan merchants would be allowed through Bhutan was a sensitive question which George did not dare to raise. Insurgents against Bhutan were still at work from their base in Tibet, but George felt the mission was accomplished with the permission for Indian merchants to travel via Bhutan. Thus, after taking leave from all important officials, George finally set off for Calcutta on 30th May 1775 with a Bhutanese official to present Bhutan's demands to the governor. Alexander Hamilton had already left for India directly from Tibet. The Bhutanese official, we may assume, was Jangchup Gyaltsen, the student of Jigme Lingpa, whom we have discussed above. A religious master in his own right, Jangchup Gyaltsen, alias Jigme Kundrol, is said to have spent about 3 years in Calcutta and other parts of Bengal as the Bhutanese vakil, or authorized representative. He was the first Bhutanese to arrive in Calcutta, where he was present at one of Hastings' concerts. He may have also been the Bhutanese official who fixed the boundaries between Bhutan and areas under the East India Company control. George's return from Bhutan was not as eventful as his journey to Bhutan, but he left Bhutan with a deep liking for the country and its people. He wrote, "The more I see of the Bhutanese, the more I am pleased with them. The common people are good-humored, downright, and I think thoroughly trusty. The statesmen have some of the art which belongs to their profession. They are the best-built race I have ever seen. Many of them are handsome, with complexions as fair as the French. I have sometimes been tempted to wish I could substitute their portrait in the place of my friend Padma's." 4 years later, he was posted as the collector at Rangpur. He fondly wrote to his sister, "Although not in my Bhutan hills, I am within sight of them." He also wrote to his brother, saying he wished to spend a month in the north, but shall regret the absence of my friend, the Panchen Lama, for whom I have a hearty liking, and should be happy again to have his fat hand on my head. The Panchen Lama was then visiting Beijing, where he had subsequently died in 1780. George himself died in Calcutta in 1781, aged only 34, just as he was planning to return to Bhutan and Tibet. His wish to return to Tibet and Bhutan was not to be, and the trade link he initiated also did not take off. Tibet sealed its southern borders by the end of the 18th century, thus triggering the myth about it as a closed and mysterious country. However, George's legacy that the two countries of Bhutan and Tibet were known, if at all, by the Western world in the subsequent decades, and by Bhutan and Tibet, these names. Before George's journey, the names were used interchangeably and very vaguely to refer to the uncharted highlands north of Bengal, stretching as far as Mongolia. The cartographers showed Tibet and Bhutan in various spellings as the same country. There is no clear knowledge of the geopolitical structure beyond the foothills. It was George's report to Hastings in 1775 which finalized once and for all the political distinction. This country, which I shall distinguish by the name of Bhutan, is said to have united under one government by Nawang Namgyal. The kingdom of Tibet lies to the northward of Bhutan. Thus, the name Bhutan, which derives from the word Bodh, Tibet, was with some arbitrariness applied by George to the kingdom of Druk, founded by Shabdrung. His legacy also included potatoes, which he had planted along his route according to Hastings' instructions. Potatoes grew fairly easily, and the Bhutanese took an immediate liking to it. They had eaten all of them in 1776 without leaving any seed. George sent Bhutanese pears. Someone sent Bhutanese pears to George as a gift. Hastings and George also tried to grow tea in Bhutan, although the project was not successful. When George showed the tea seeds to Drungpa in 1780, the Bhutanese official got up and danced around them out of sheer joy, as this could save the huge amount of money that left Bhutan for tea brought overland from China. It was a remarkable foresight of Hastings to attempt this some 50 years before tea plantation in India actually took off. Thank you guys for listening. Take care.